For the reader, genre helps us to distinguish between texts. There are loads of texts out there, and genre helps us to categorize them, to group them, to find connections and differences between them. This kind of categorization may, to some extent, be a simplification, but it's also a necessary way of making sense, of imposing order. But genres don't just help us to divide up texts, to categorize them. They're also important in creating the meaning of a text. Whatever text we read or watch, we're constantly asking ourselves, what kind of text is this, whether we are aware of it or not? What kind of writing something claims to be, through the title perhaps, or through subtle generic signals, creates different expectations for us that actually shape the way we read. So, ideas about genre, shared between writer and reader, function as a kind of unspoken contract. If a play announces itself as a comedy, for example, we feel that the writer has promised not to kill off all the main characters in the final scene. But sometimes it isn't clear as we read a text what its generic status is, and so we might make various assumptions which shape our reading experience in different ways. Let's illustrate this process by looking at a made-up example of an opening paragraph of a novel taken from a critical study of genre. I'd like you to read this paragraph, imagining that it's the start of a novel called Murder at Marplethorpe. The clock on the mantelpiece said 10:30, but someone had suggested recently that the clock was wrong. As the figure of the dead woman lay on the bed in the front room, a no less silent figure glided rapidly from the house. The only sounds to be heard were the ticking of that clock and the loud wailing of an infant. What assumptions did you make about this passage? How did the title, which suggests that this is a novel in the detective fiction genre, shape your reading? Did you assume that the figure of the dead woman who lay on the bed is the murder victim, and that the silent figure who's skulking around is probably the murderer? Did you pay particular attention to details such as the time on the clock and the fact that the clock was wrong, assuming that these would be clues that might be helpful later on? Did you, in other words, read the text in accordance with certain generic codes? Now let's think about what the effect of a different title might be. What if I said that this is actually the beginning of a novel called The Personal History of David Marplethorpe? This title suggests that the novel belongs to the genre of the Bildungsroman, the story of an individual coming of age. Examples of famous works in this genre would include Charles Dickens, David Copperfield, and James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Let's look at the paragraph again, imagining that this is the opening of the personal history of David Marplethorpe. The clock on the mantelpiece said 10:30, but someone had suggested recently that the clock was wrong. As the figure of the dead woman lay on the bed in the front room, a no less silent figure glided rapidly from the house. The only sounds to be heard were the ticking of that clock and the loud wailing of an infant. How did you read the passage in accordance with this new title? Did you start imagining that the baby is the hero, David Marplethorpe, and the dead woman, his mother, who died during childbirth? Did you guess that the silent figure is the midwife, or perhaps David's distraught father going for help? Did you perhaps think about how the faulty clock might be read symbolically, as suggesting that the start of David's life was uncertain, unsettled from the outset? What this example shows is that even the title of a book can set up different generic expectations which change the way we read, the way we process the information. We might not even be aware of it, but as we're reading literary texts, we're constantly responding to certain generic signals that the writer gives us. What we've seen then is that genre forms a kind of understanding between author and reader, within which certain, often very subtle kinds of communication are possible. But of course, what a lot of literary texts do, as we'll explore in the next section, is not simply to meet the expectations of the reader, but to play with those expectations. So, literary texts engage in different ways with particular generic conventions, and in the process might challenge, modify, or play with the expectations that a reader, familiar with those conventions, brings to a text. Indeed, this is often part of what makes literary texts so interesting. Let's illustrate this with one example. Jane Austen, early in her writing career, wrote a short novel called Northanger Abbey. At the time she was writing, Gothic fiction was highly popular. Gothic fiction is, of course, a genre with lots of very recognisable conventions, including spooky locations, such as old dark castles, and particular character types, such as the vulnerable, beautiful young lady and the evil villain. Northanger Abbey engages with these conventions and with the expectations that they generate in readers in particularly knowing and sophisticated ways, as we'll see in the following series of extracts. The night was stormy. The wind had been rising at intervals the whole afternoon, and by the time the party broke up, it blew and rained violently. Catherine, as she crossed the hall, listened to the tempest with sensations of awe, and, when she heard it rage round a corner of the ancient building and close with sudden fury a distant door, felt for the first time that she really was in an abbey. Here Austen sets a classic Gothic scene, with a storm, an ancient building, and a lone heroine. The heroine returns to her room and prepares for bed. Catherine was beginning to think of stepping into bed when, on giving a parting glance round the room, she was struck by the appearance of a high, old-fashioned black cabinet, which, though in a situation conspicuous enough, had never caught her notice before. Like Catherine, we're invited to think that there may be something odd or mysterious about this black cabinet. Catherine proceeds to examine the cabinet and, after some difficulty, to unlock it, only to find inside it another small door, also locked. As we'll see in the next extract, Catherine sets about investigating this inner cavity. It was some time, however, before she could unfasten the door, but at length it did open, and not vain as hitherto was her search. Her quick eyes directly fell on a roll of paper, pushed back into the further part of the cavity, apparently for concealment, and her feelings at that moment were indescribable. Her heart fluttered, her knees trembled, and her cheeks grew pale. She seized, with an unsteady hand, the precious manuscript. Before she's able to read this manuscript, however, her candle, her only source of light, is extinguished, plunging her into total darkness. As the storm continues to rage outside, Catherine has no choice but to crawl into bed and wait for daylight to come. The reader, like Catherine, is left in suspense. Here's what happens when morning finally comes and Catherine is able to see what she had found. Her greedy eye glanced rapidly over a page. She started at its import. Could it be possible, or did not her senses play her false? An inventory of linen, in coarse and modern characters, seemed all that was before her. If the evidence of sight might be trusted, she held a washing bill in her hand. Such was the collection of papers, left perhaps, as she could then suppose, by the negligence of a servant in the place whence she had taken them, which had filled her with expectation and alarm and robbed her of half her night's rest. She felt humbled to the dust. Catherine feels humbled as she discovers the truth, but so might the reader. If we are familiar with the conventions of the Gothic novel, we may have read this episode sharing her assumptions that the manuscript must be something mysterious or even sinister, because that's what tends to happen in Gothic fiction. Now we realise that this story isn't, after all, conforming to those conventions. Austen is here creating a much more mundane, realistic world in which seemingly strange things have everyday explanations. What Austen did in writing Northanger Abbey, then, was not simply to write what we might call a straight Gothic novel, but to write a parody of the Gothic genre. A parody which is, of course, dependent on its readers' familiarity with the conventions of that genre. In the process, Austen is inviting us to reflect on how we read, on how our reading of one text or one group of texts creates certain expectations which we then bring to the next seemingly similar text that we read. She is showing us how expectations shape our reading and allow us to be manipulated. She is, in other words, making us aware of genre and how it works. So, we've seen that genre matters to literary works such as Northanger Abbey, but that such works don't simply or passively follow conventions. Rather, some of the most interesting literary texts shape and reshape generic conventions, play with the expectations of the reader, and reflect self-consciously on the processes of literary production and interpretation. There are, then, lots of questions you might think about in relation to any literary text you read. What kind of a text is it? Does it seem to you to belong to one particular genre or to several genres? What is it that constitutes its generic affiliations? If, for example, you think a particular work is a tragedy, what is it that makes it tragic? Is it the subject matter? Is it the way it's written? Is it the effect on the reader? And what is the relationship between subject matter, style, and effect? You might also try comparing works belonging to different genres, say a Shakespearean tragedy and a Shakespearean comedy. Does this help to clarify the conventions of each genre? You might think about whether a given literary text seems to be knowing or self-conscious about its relationship to a particular genre, whether, for example, it seems to be parodying particular conventions. You might consider how a particular text manipulates a reader's expectations. And you might look for generic connections between different texts you've read, for ways in which you can group them according to genre. These are all questions and exercises that will help you to understand the complex and endlessly fascinating relationship between authors, texts, and readers.